The summer Elias Varga turned 11, his father brought home a box of old maps from a yard sale on the edge of Debrecen. And that was the summer Elias understood that the world was larger and stranger and more beautiful than the flat Hungarian plain he had grown up on could possibly suggest. He spread them on his bedroom floor. Survey maps of the Carpathians, a French maritime chart of the Adriatic coast, a German military map from the First World War with troop movements marked in faded red pencil, and one map, the one that mattered, of a city he couldn't identify, with streets named in a script he couldn't read, with a harbor shaped like a crescent moon. He stared at that unknown city for an entire afternoon, trying to will it into familiarity, feeling the gorgeous frustration of not knowing. The girl next door was named Sára Fekete. She was 9 years old and she had no patience for the things Elias was patient about: sitting still, reading, the careful, slow pleasure of figuring things out. She moved through the world at a speed that exhausted him and delighted him in equal measure. When she knocked on his window that afternoon and he let her in and showed her the unknown city map, she looked at it for approximately 4 seconds before saying, "It's Thessaloniki. I've been there. It's nice. They have good fish." Elias stared at her. "How do you know that?" She shrugged. "The Crescent Harbor. My grandmother showed me pictures." She picked up the French maritime chart and began to unfold it in that careless way that made Elias wince. "Can we go outside now?" They went outside. But Elias kept the map of Thessaloniki, and for years afterward he thought of it as Sára's map, the way he thought of nearly everything from that period as connected to her. The apricot tree in his backyard, the specific angle of late summer light, the smell of cut grass and diesel from the road. Childhood is the country we spend the rest of our lives mapping from memory, and Sára Fekete was the cardinal direction everything else was measured from. They grew up side by side the way children do, when proximity becomes its own kind of intimacy, inseparable and then gradually separable, the distance growing in centimeters that neither of them quite noticed. Elias was the quiet one, the serious one, the one who won regional mathematics competitions and read books about geography, and spent 3 weeks one summer teaching himself to navigate by the stars using a library book and a compass that pointed slightly wrong. Sára was the one who made everything feel possible and slightly dangerous. She talked strangers into things. She convinced the old groundskeeper at the village church to let them climb the bell tower, convinced a visiting professor to let them sit in on a university lecture about archaeology, convinced Elias, more times than he could count, that the boring and sensible thing was always the wrong thing. He loved her. Of course he loved her. He was 11 and then 13 and then 15, and the love changed as he changed, went from the simple animal warmth of childhood companionship to something with an ache in it, something that made him aware of his own body and hers in ways that embarrassed him when he thought about them directly. He never told her. This was partly shyness and partly a particular fear he couldn't have named at 15, but could name clearly by 30, the fear that saying it would change the coordinates of everything, that the map he had been navigating by would shift under his feet and leave him lost in some territory he didn't recognize. So he kept it inside him like the unknown city on the old map, something precious precisely because it was unexplained. When Elias was 17, his family moved to Budapest for his father's work. The distance between Debrecen and Budapest is 222 kilometers, which in the geography of adolescence is approximately infinite. He and Sára wrote letters, actual letters, because Elias had always preferred the weight of paper to the weightlessness of screens, and because Sára had once said, in that offhand way she had of saying things that stayed with him for years, that she would rather have something she could hold. The letters were frequent at first, and then less frequent, and then occasional, the rhythm of them following the natural law that governs all correspondence between people whose lives are diverging, which is the law of entropy. Disorder increases unless energy is applied, and energy is the one thing that adolescence and early adulthood distribute erratically. But they didn't lose each other. That's the important thing. Even when months went by without a letter, even when whole years passed with only a brief message at Christmas and birthdays, there was a thread between them that neither of them could quite describe or quite cut. When Elias, at 22, was accepted to the geography program at the University of Vienna, the first person he told was Sára. When Sára, at 20, survived a car accident outside Debrecen that broke her left arm in 2 places, she called Elias from the hospital before she called anyone else except her mother. He drove to Debrecen that weekend. He sat with her while her arm was set in a cast, and she made jokes about it being her left arm and therefore not the useful one. He wrote his name on her cast in the careful cartographic script he used for map annotations, and she laughed and said he was the only person she knew who had actual handwriting anymore. He drove back to Vienna on Sunday night, and he thought, for the entire 240 kilometers, about what it would have meant if the accident had been worse. He became a cartographer, not in the traditional sense. The era of making new physical maps of unknown territories had largely passed, but in the modern, digital sense. He worked for a consulting firm in Vienna that produced precision geographic data for urban planning projects, environmental surveys, infrastructure assessment. It was detailed and technical and largely invisible work, the kind of work that makes the world function without making headlines. He was good at it. He was good at it because he was patient and precise, and because he had a genuine feeling for the relationship between the abstraction of a map and the physical reality it described. The way a map was always a translation, always a reduction, always a set of choices about what to keep and what to leave out, and the choices revealed as much about the mapmaker as about the territory. He was 31 when Sára came to Vienna. She had been living in Berlin for 3 years, working in architecture. She had studied it at Budapest University, had spent 2 years in a firm in Munich, and had recently been recruited by a practice in Vienna that was doing ambitious civic work. She called him from the airport. She said, in the same tone she had always used, the tone that suggested the world was full of interesting things, and she planned to investigate all of them. "I'm going to be your neighbor again, Elias. Try not to be boring about it." He was not boring about it. They fell into each other's company with the ease of people who have a shared history deep enough to dispense with the getting-to-know-you phase. They had dinner twice a week, and then 3 times, and then it became a standing arrangement, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and usually Sunday morning when the city was quiet. He showed her the parts of Vienna he had made his own over 8 years. The coffee house on the Naschmarkt, where the waiters were rude in an oddly comforting way. The stretch of the Danube Canal, where the light was best in late afternoon. The second-hand bookshop in the 7th District, where the owner sorted books by color rather than subject, and somehow this made perfect sense. She showed him how to see the architecture. She had a way of stopping on a street and making him stop too, of pointing at a facade or a roofline or the particular way a building met the street, and explaining what the designer had been thinking and what they had gotten right and what they had gotten wrong. And under her instruction, the city became a different place. Richer, stranger, more deliberate. In March, 6 months after she arrived, he told her. He had been going to tell her for 6 months, and then for 20 years before that, and one evening after dinner at his apartment, with the last of a bottle of Austrian Gruner Veltliner between them and the city making its evening sounds outside, he simply said it. He said that he had been in love with her since he was 15 years old, and that he suspected he would be in love with her for the rest of his life regardless of what she said. And he wanted her to know that, and he was sorry if it was inconvenient. She looked at him for a long moment. Her face did something complicated that he couldn't read, which was unusual. He had been reading her face for 20 years. Then she said, "I know I've always known." And she reached across the table and took his hand. "And yes," she said, "obviously yes." The year that followed was the year Elias Varga had been, without quite knowing it, navigating toward for 31 years of his life. Not perfect, no year is perfect, but true, in the way that a well-made map is true, accurate to the territory, faithful to the actual shape of things. They were good together in the ways that mattered. Their silences were comfortable, their arguments were productive rather than destructive. They made each other laugh with a frequency and ease that neither of them had found with anyone else. She pushed him out of his comfortable patterns. He gave her a stillness she hadn't known she was missing. She left architectural sketches all over his apartment. He taught her, Finally, to navigate by the stars, on a camping trip in the Waldviertel on a cloudless night in August, the two of them lying on their backs in a field while he named constellations, and she pointed out, reasonably, that most of them looked nothing like what they were supposed to represent. "Orion doesn't look like a hunter," she said. "He does, if you know what you're looking for. That's what you always say about maps, too." "It's true about maps, too." She turned her head toward him in the dark. "What do you look for when you look at me?" He thought about it. "The thing that's always been there," he said, "since Thessaloniki." "I've never been to Thessaloniki." "You told me about it when I was 11. You knew the harbor was shaped like a crescent moon." She was quiet for a moment. "I remember that," she said. "I remember thinking you were the most serious child I'd ever seen. You were staring at that map like it owed you something." "It did. It had a city I didn't know." "And now?" "Now I know it," he said. She laughed, soft and genuine, the laugh he had been hearing for 20 years. She took his hand, and above them the stars did their slow, indifferent rotation, and he thought, This is what I have been drawing the map toward." He was a cartographer. He should have known that territories change, that even the most accurate map goes out of date, that the most dangerous lie a map can tell is that the ground is stable. What Elias didn't know, what he had no reason to know, what was being kept from him with the same careful, systematic precision that a good mapmaker uses to keep irrelevant details off a chart, was that Sára had not come to Vienna only for the architectural firm. She had come for a man named Daniel Richter. Daniel was a partner at the same firm, a German architect 15 years older than Sára, married, brilliant, and as thoroughly entangled with her as she was with him. The entanglement had begun in Berlin, in the last year she was there, and it had not ended when she moved. It was, by the time she arrived in Vienna and called Elias from the airport with that teasing familiar tone, already 2 years old. Why had she said yes to Elias? He would ask himself this question for years afterward and arrive at different answers on different days. The most honest answer, the one he eventually settled on because it was painful enough to feel true, was that she had said yes because she meant it, because what she felt for Elias was real, some version of love, the deep bone-level attachment of a life spent in parallel. And also because Daniel Richter was unavailable, periodically distant, prone to the kind of withdrawal that cycles through men who will not leave their marriages, and Elias was there, and constant, and had always been there. She had not thought it through. She had done what people do when they are in complicated pain, reached for the thing that felt safe. Elias found out in November, not from Sára. From a colleague at her firm, someone who knew Daniel Richter slightly and did not know Elias at all, who mentioned Daniel's name in the course of a conversation at a professional event, described him as being deeply involved with one of the younger architects. The woman said Sára's name without hesitation, without apparent awareness that she was handing Elias something that would disassemble his year into component parts. He drove home. He sat in his apartment with the architectural sketches on the table and the star maps on the wall and the Thessaloniki map. The original, the one Sára had identified when they were 9 and 11, which he had framed and kept all these years, and he tried to find the shape of what had happened, to map it, to reduce it to something that could be understood and held. He could not. It was the kind of information that resists cartography, that keeps moving under the pen. He called her. She answered immediately, which told him that she had been expecting this, had perhaps been both dreading and waiting for it. He told her what he knew. She did not deny it. She said his name once in a way that contained apology and anguish and something that was almost relief, and he understood the relief because he recognized it from the Byzantine history he had read in school. The relief of the conspiracy revealed, the weight of deception finally put down. He said, "How long?" She told him. He said, "When you came to Vienna." "Yes." "When you said yes." "Elias, I need you to answer me." A pause that lasted a long time. Then, "I meant it. I want you to know that I meant it. It doesn't." "It does," he said. "It means everything." He hung up. He did not speak to her for 4 months. This was not a decision he made cleanly. It was something he arrived at by accident and then maintained by will, like a man who stumbles into a river and discovers that staying afloat requires constant effort. He went to work. He made his maps. He sat in the coffee house on the Nashmarkt where the waiters were rude and found that the rudeness now felt less comforting and more simply rude, which was probably how it had always been and he simply hadn't noticed. He was not destroyed. This surprised him, actually. He had expected to be destroyed, had feared it, had used it for years as a reason not to speak, not to risk, not to tell her how he felt. He had been wrong about the destruction. What happened instead was more interesting and in some ways more terrible. He was not destroyed, he was changed, and the change was permanent in the way that certain geographical events are permanent. An earthquake, a flood that cuts a new channel. The ground was the same ground, but its features were rearranged, and the old map was wrong now, and he had to make a new one. What had been taken from him, this was what he spent 4 months working out, was not Sára exactly. It was the version of Sára he had been carrying since he was 9 years old. The girl who knew the harbor was shaped like a crescent moon. The girl on the maps. That version had never quite existed, or had existed only in the way that maps exist, as a representation, accurate in some ways and necessarily incomplete, a set of choices about what to keep and what to leave out. The choices had been his. The incompleteness had been his. He had mapped her the way a devoted but too partial cartographer maps a beloved territory, emphasizing the beautiful, omitting the difficult, so that the final product was faithful to his feeling and not entirely faithful to the place. He was a cartographer. He understood this failure. He did not forgive it, but he understood it. In March, a year after the night on the camping trip, the night of the constellations, she came to his apartment. He opened the door because he had been expecting her, in the way you expect things that are both inevitable and unwanted. She looked like herself and unlike herself, which he supposed was how he looked to her too. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee between them and talked for 2 hours. Not about Daniel Richter. That was over, apparently, had been over since November, which was not a coincidence and not a consolation. About the year. About what it had been and what it had actually been, and the difference between those two things. She was honest in a way that cost her something. He could see that, and he was honest back, and the honesty was brutal and necessary and not enough to fix anything. At the end, she said, "I don't expect you to forgive me." "I know," he said. "Do you?" He looked at the Thessaloniki map on the wall. The Crescent Harbor. The streets in the script he couldn't read, that she had identified in 4 seconds when she was 9 years old, with no apparent effort, the way she did everything. "I think I was in love with a map," he said. "For 20 years, I mistook the map for the place." She was quiet, absorbing this. "Is that better or worse?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think it means what happened is partly mine." She left, and he sat for a long time, and the apartment was full of her absence, which was different from the ordinary absence of someone who has gone home. It was the absence of someone who has gone for good, from a particular version of a particular place, and the place will never be that version again. He opened his drafting software. He had a project due, a topographic survey of the Vienna woods, precision contour lines, the careful, patient work of describing a landscape in a language of abstraction. He began to work. Outside, the city went on. The Danube was where it had always been. The stars were in their positions. The world was exactly as mappable and exactly as unmappable as it had always been. He worked until midnight. When he stopped, his eyes ached in the pleasant way they did after a long, focused stretch, and the map on his screen was accurate and complete and faithful to its territory, and he thought, "This is what I know how to do." It was not everything, but it was real, and it was his, and he had made it. Cartographers use the term scale to describe the relationship between the size of a map and the size of the territory it represents. A map at one scale would be the same size as the territory, useless, unmanageable, the territory itself in paper form. All useful maps involve a reduction. All reduction involves loss. The question a cartographer is always answering, in every choice of scale, is, what is worth keeping? Elias Varga continued to make maps. He was very good at it. In the years after that March evening, he became known in his field for a particular quality in his work, a kind of honesty about what was unknown, a willingness to leave areas blank rather than fill them in with guesswork, to mark uncertainty as uncertainty rather than papering over it with confident lines. His colleagues thought this was a stylistic preference. It was not a stylistic preference. He saw Sára sometimes. Vienna was not a small city, but it was not large enough, between two people with overlapping circles, to make avoidance easy or natural. They reached, over a period of years, something he did not have a word for in Hungarian or German or any of the 4 other languages he had enough of to be useful. Not friendship exactly, not its absence either. Something in between, something that required its own legend, its own key, the way all territories eventually require their own map and cannot be read by one made for somewhere else. The Thessaloniki map stayed on his wall. He kept it because it was old and valuable and because it had been his first. Not because of her. That was the honest version, the version he had earned. The map had been his before she had ever identified it, and it was his still, and the harbor was still shaped like a crescent moon, and that was true regardless of anything else. In his 30s, he finally went to Thessaloniki, took the train from Vienna to Athens and a connection north along the Aegean coast. He stood at the waterfront and looked at the harbor, which was exactly as described, crescent-shaped, gleaming, busy with ferries and fishing boats and the ordinary traffic of a working port. He took a photograph. He thought about sending it to her and did not send it. He kept it for himself instead on his phone and looked at it sometimes, and it meant what it meant. That the map had been right, that the territory was real, that some things are exactly what you were told they were, and that is something. When you are 34 years old and have learned to distrust your own cartography, that is genuinely something. He ate fish at a restaurant by the water. The fish was good. She had said the fish was good when she was 9 years old, speaking from memory of a place she had been with her grandmother. Some things you are told when you are young, and you carry them your whole life, and they turn out to be true. This, he thought, was worth mapping. And